Today on the show, we're going to talk about Jubilee from the X-Men. If you didn't know that in 2004 she had her own comic book series that was cancelled after only 6 issues, then this show is for you. Jubilee, a member of the X-Men, created in 1989, first appearing in the Uncanny X-Men number 244. Now, I know a lot of people believe that she was created for the 90s X-Men cartoon, but production for that didn't start till 1991, which means she was already around for 2 years before the cartoon was even thought up. So, Jubilee, or Jubilation Lee as her parents would have known her, was from a freakishly wealthy Chinese-American background, and she was also a very talented gymnast. But then, in one weekend, her whole life was turned upside down. Jubilee's parents were murdered by a pair of hitmen that mistook Jubilee's parents for their neighbours, who were also called the Lees. After her parents were murdered, Jubilee was taken away to an orphanage, but she was like, nope, not having any of this, and she ran away to the Hollywood Mall. So while in the mall, Jubilee would steal food to survive, but then one day she was caught stealing food. Obviously she had to run away from the mall guards, but they managed to chase her into a back alley, and while in the back alley, the stress from the chase just kind of made her powers manifest, and she released a giant light blast, temporarily blinding the guards. Obviously, our young Jubilee escaped, and she saw an opportunity where a lot of other people saw a problem. She decided that she was going to perform light shows outside the mall for money to be able to afford food so she wouldn't have to steal it anymore. Now, obviously, the mall wasn't too happy about having a mutant performing outside, let alone a mutant that had just escaped from them, so they hired a group of mutant hunters called the M Squad to come and catch our young Jubilation. Jubilee actually holds her own against the M Squad, but she would be rescued by a group of X-Men who were having a girls' day out at the time. These X-Men were Rogue, Storm, Dazzler, and Psylocke. As far as I'm aware, these were the first mutants that Jubilee had ever encountered, so she decided to follow them out of the mall and see where they were going, and she actually ended up following them into a portal. It's super effective! So, when Jubilee goes through the portal, she arrives at the X-Men's temporary Australian outback base. And while here, she decides to stay hidden using her rebellious nature and her wit. Quick side note, there is a mutant that knows she's there that's actually Gateway, who created the portal that Jubilee came through. While at the base, to survive, Jubilee steals food and borrows clothes from other X-Men, but one day Colossus actually notices that there's some food missing, but then Nanny attacks, and Colossus gets too distracted by the attack by Nanny to do anything. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Jubilee fights Nanny, and it turns out that Jubilee's powers can actually neutralize Nanny's brainwashing, and also Jubilee destroys a robotic dog using her powers, and this was the first time that her powers were used for offense instead of defense. Soon after this, the base seemed to be empty and Jubilee decided to explore, and upon exploring the back caverns of the base, she found Wolverine tied to an X-shaped cross, being tortured by the Reavers. Eventually, the Reavers notice that a storm is about to start, so they go back inside, and Jubilee has to decide whether she's going to help Wolverine and risk getting caught, but if she is caught, she could be in Wolverine's position, or is she going to just stay hidden and help herself? And she decides to stay hidden, and she watches as the storm rages on. After the storm, Wolverine goes into one of his berserker rages and breaks free of the cross, and then collapses. Side note, Wolverine was nailed to that cross, and Jubilee takes Wolverine into her hiding spot inside of the base. Jubilee actually had to nurse Wolverine back to health because his healing factor had totally maxed itself out, so his healing process was very slow and very painful, but eventually she'd get him back to near health when the Reavers would find our duo. our duo would go to Madripoor, where they would fight the Mandarin and various other people. Jubilee is actually really important here, and it's when you realize that her powers are actually really powerful. One, not only does she hold her own against the Hand, but number two, she blows up a section of the Mandarin's castle when she, Wolverine, and Psylocke were being kept prisoner. Jubilee stayed with Wolverine for quite a while, but she never really adapted to the traveling lifestyle. I mean, she missed American food and culture way too much. Eventually, she and the X-Men would go to the Shi'ar Empire, where she would be captured by the War Scrolls, and this is where she would meet Professor Xavier for the first time. Over time, Wolverine and Jubilee would develop a father-daughter type relationship, and I think this is good because Jubilee's rebellious nature was probably born out of the fact that her parents died and she had nothing to fill that void. Wolverine and Jubilee actually go on to take down the hitmen that killed Jubilee's parents, and Jubilee wants to kill them, and Wolverine has to calm her down. Our hero would go on to join the X-Men's Blue Team, and she's actually a very vital part of the team. I mean, she is usually the one that saves people and even other X-Men. Jubilee is actually very close with a number of members from the team, particularly Beast, who she enjoys getting piggyback rides from, and Professor X, who, when he gets his legs back temporarily, she takes rollerblading. This being said, there was some tension between Jubilee and Kitty Pryde, and this is probably because Kitty Pryde was actually in Jubilee's position before her, with the whole Wolverine sidekick thing, and this does take some talking out. Eventually, Generation X would be formed and Jubilee would join. Now, Generation X was essentially a group of teenage mutants that were educated by Emma Frost and Banshee in education, but also fighting, combat, survival skills, and all that fun stuff that a future X-Man would need to know. To this day, I kind of question the decision to put Jubilee in Generation X. I mean, she was more than experienced with the X-Men, and that is really clearly shown in the comics. Generation X would face this guy called Emplate a lot, and one time he would siphon Jubilee's powers, but Jubilee uses her sarcasm and wit to anger Emplate, so he loses control of her powers, causing him to blast himself with energy. During the group's final battle with Emplate, Jubilee would use her powers to blow up Proud Star Hall to defeat Emplate. Next, Jubilee is kidnapped and held hostage by Bastion, and she manages to resist all of his mental probing and doesn't give up any information about the X-Men. And she would even go on to stage an escape, but it was her innocence and kindness that led to her being captured again when she gives CPR to a guard that she has injured. She does eventually escape with the help of Daria, Bastion's assistant, and then she holds her own against a Prime Sentinel by blasting its vision receptors, but in the end she is saved by Wolverine, who takes her back to the X-Men. Soon after this, Generation X would disband and Jubilee would go back to LA to pursue an acting career. This didn't go well. She would only get cast in stereotypical Asian roles, and her agent would try and put her on the casting couch. Soon after this, she joined Banshee's X-Corps team, which she only really joined to keep an eye on Banshee, and in this time she only really used her powers for their passive nature, like she would blind enemies instead of making them explode. After this, Jubilee would go back to LA with her friend Skin, and this is where she would be kidnapped and her and several other mutants would be crucified on the front lawn of the X Mansion. Jubilee and a number of other crucified mutants would be healed thanks to Angel's healing blood, but Skin wouldn't be so lucky and would pass away. After Skin's funeral, the Gravekeeper reveals that he will not allow a mutant to be buried in his graveyard, so he totally unemotionally hands Jubilee Skin's ashes. After this, Cyclops decides that Jubilee needs an emotional break and takes her off the active roster of X-Men. It's super effective! After this, there was this really weird thing with a long-lost relative of Jubilee's called Aunt Hope, who turned out to be an assassin and would die in an explosion, but not die in the explosion, she just got pushed back, and it was a whole mess of things, but at the end of it, Jubilee would move back into the X-Mansion. After a while, it will be revealed that Jubilee lost her powers on M-Day, and she'll be captured and taken to Berlin as hostage. Wolverine uses S.H.I.E.L.D. to find Jubilee, and when they do find her, she is beaten and badly hurt, so Wolverine exchanges his freedom for Jubilee's safety. The next time we would see Jubilee, she wouldn't be Jubilee anymore, but Wondra, and she is the second in command for the New Warriors, and she has powers that come from technology. The technology that she uses gives her the ability of super strength, to the point that she can lift a locomotive engine above her head. In this role, Jubilee is a lot more cold and a lot more serious. And I think this is really good writing because it really does show that a mutant's powers is part of their personality. Next, after leaving the New Warriors, Jubilee goes to San Francisco where she meets up with a group of younger mutants who tell her about Utopia, which is an island home for all mutants, and Jubilee re-establishes herself as a mutant. This being said, she still doesn't have any powers and she makes the decision to not join the X-Men on Utopia. This is where things get really good, and it didn't happen that long ago either. So Cyclops sends out Pixie to go and check on Jubilee, and while the two of them are having a bit of a chat, Jubilee is infected with a virus by a vampire suicide bomber. Our hero is taken to the X-Men HQ where they run all sorts of tests on her, and they find that she is indeed being slowly turned into a vampire and thus unable to handle sunlight. While this is going on, others with the virus turn into full-out vampires and begin to enact the plans of the mystery Lord of the Vampires. A bit of time passes by and Jubilee reveals that there's something calling for her, and Dr. Nemesis tells her to fight it, but Jubilee reveals that she doesn't want to fight it. And then the X-Men meet up to discuss what to do about the death of Dracula and the new Lord of the Vampires. Dr. Kavita Rao checks on Jubilee and is attacked. Jubilee then leaves Utopia, goes to Zaras, gets bitten and turns into a full-fledged vampire, and it is revealed that this was done so the X-Men would come and save Jubilee and fall into a trap. After this whole ordeal, Jubilee would remain a vampire and would be kept in a holding cell under Utopia. Then, at Gambit's request, Wolverine takes Jubilee to Paris, and X-23 is there, so there is a bit of tension between X-23 and Jubilee, but they end up developing this weird stepsister type relationship in a weird, messed up kind of way. X-23 helps Jubilee with her urges to kill, and Jubilee teaches X-23 how to be a normal girl. Then, while in Paris, Jubilee is taken in by a group of vampires called the Forgiven, who have evolved beyond the need for blood and can move about in daylight. Years pass by, we're caught up to Marvel now, and Jubilee makes a return with a baby. But I'm not going to get into that. The event that Jubilee makes her return in has literally just finished. It's called X-Men Battle of the Atom. You should totally check it out. I've provided a link down below. So where do I stand on Jubilee? Well, she is my favourite member of the X-Men. You can judge me all you want for it, but it will remain true. And yes, while over the years she has become very weak and somewhat useless, I am happy that she's back, because to get strong again, she's got to be around.
It's super effective!
Okay guys, that is it for today. If you think I missed anything about Jubilee, please let me know in the comments down below, and also don't forget to thumbs up and subscribe. My name is Faust, this has been Exploring Comics, and it is super effective.